So I am delighted to introduce you to, but you may already know, Father Simmons, who is an assistant professor of theology right here at Marquette and a proud alumnus of Marquette, the Arts and Sciences in 04, the College of Arts and Sciences, that is. His areas of interest include theology and literature, the theological turn in phenomenology and fundamental theology, as well as atheism and secularity. His recent publications include a treatment of intersubjectivity in Nicholas of Cusa's De Vision Dei, and a theological reading of domesticity in Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping. And let's see, so I'm going to turn it over to Father Simmons, and we have some PowerPoints, and we are recording the talk. So thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa Gans, for the invitation to speak to all of you, and I hope to kind of stimulate a conversation that we'll be able to have after my presentation today, which is entitled, as you see, A Pope's Hope for the Humanities, Reading Francis's Love Letter to Literature. I begin with a short story from the New Yorker that my friend Father Kevin Spinelli, who teaches at Fordham, sent my way a number of years ago. It was written by a contemporary American author, Steve Millhauser, in 2006, and it's entitled, In the Reign of King Herod IV. Millhauser is often compared to Jorge Luis Borges or Italo Calvino, both of whom introduce a fantastical dimension to their fiction. This story tells of a craftsman who makes miniature models in the court of King Herod IV. Imagine, if you will, those who craft small model railroads or dollhouses or castles. The best miniaturists shrink something enormous in size and intricacy down to a tiny copy of the real thing. In the story, the king takes delight in the craftsman's ability to make a miniature of the king's 600-room palace. People marvel at the intricacies of his work. However, the miniaturist feels unsatisfied in his work. Imagine how many hours he has spent honing his craft, yet still he feels empty and restless. You'll pardon a longer quotation from the story which we have on our slide here. Do we have a volunteer to read? Otherwise you're going to get tired of hearing my voice. Any volunteers to read? Ed, would you be willing to read?
I'll see what I can do with my eyes.
Okay.
One day after the completion of an arduous and exhilarating task, he had made for one of the miniature orchards a basket of brilliantly lifelike red and green apples, each one no longer larger than a pit of a cherry. And as a finishing touch, he had placed on the stem of one apple a perfectly reproduced copper fly. The maker of miniatures felt in himself a stirring of restlessness. It wasn't the first time he had experienced such stirrings at the end of a long task, but lately the odd internal itching had become more insistent. As he tried to penetrate the feeling, to reveal it more clearly to himself, he thought of the basket of apples.
He thought of the basket of apples, and Dr. Dempsey, could you continue reading on the next slide for us?
The basket had been unusually satisfying to make because it had presented him with a hierarchy of sizes. The basket itself, composed of separate slats of boxwood bound with copper wire, then the apples, and at last the fly. The tiny fly with its precisely rendered wings had caused him the most difficulty and the most joy, and it occurred to him that there was no particular reason to stop at the fly. Suddenly, he was seized by an inner trembling. Why had he never thought of this before? How was it possible? Didn't logic itself demand that the downward series be pursued? At this thought, he felt a deep, guilty excitement, as if he had come to a forbidden door at the end of a private corridor, and heard, as he slowly turned the key, a sound of distant music.
Thank you. Well done. This is a good eyesight test and also kinesthetic learning and moving. Now, those who love the stream of consciousness of a writer like Virginia Woolf will recognize something of the tunneling vision that she champions in her fiction. The ability of a character to go deeper and deeper into his or her interior world. The miniaturist in our story plunges so deep into this miniature world that his output, the fruit of his expertise and attention, has become so minuscule that it becomes ever harder and harder to share it with anyone else. Finally, he decides, with an absurdist flourish towards the end of the story, to delve into the realm of the invisible and create an entire invisible kingdom. Two of the craftsman's apprentices visit him as he is fashioning this invisible kingdom. He permits them to gaze upon his work through the magnifying glass. Though they can see absolutely nothing, they are quick to offer polite praise. Here are the final lines of our story. The maker of miniatures, knowing that they had seen nothing, that their words were hollow, and that they would never visit him again, returned with some impatience to his work. And as he sank below the crust of the visible world into his dazzling kingdom, he understood that he had traveled a long way from the early days, that he still had far to go, and that from now on his life would be difficult and without forgiveness. The tunneling vision of his excellence isolates him even from those who might share his passion. The miniaturist has total control over an increasingly smaller kingdom, to the point where it has disappeared. He understood that he had traveled a long way from the early days. But there is no longer anything to share, nothing to be enjoyed, because there is no point of entry for his protégés. This is a remarkable short story to read and discuss in a class, open to many interpretations, as you can imagine, about artistic craft, about dedicated focus, and getting lost, for better or worse, in one's worldview. I'll return to the story towards the end of my presentation, but for our purposes at the beginning, I would suggest that we members of faculty in higher education risk becoming like this miniaturist who plunges deeper and deeper into his own discipline, such that he can no longer communicate even with those interested in his own craft. Now, I might hear some clicking of tongues already, so let me address an important objection here. Each of us who are engaged in the academic life, we're engaged in a specific discipline, and we've been hired to do precisely this because this is our expertise, because we have passion in going deep in a particular field of study, and rightly so. I'm not advocating for dilettantish dabbling in absolutely everything. However, I think the miniaturist cautions us about forgetting the larger picture of the enterprise of the humanities, and indeed of the university, the joint formation of the human soul and the human mind. But not just my soul and mind, but that of our students and of our colleagues. All of this is a rather slow introduction to the topic today on the role of literature in that of formation. And here's where Pope Francis comes in, a remarkable letter written this past summer. And if you'd like to email me later, I'm happy to send you a PDF version that I did for my students. It's a little bit easier to read, and it even includes some pictures. In July 2024, Pope Francis penned a letter entitled, "On the Role of Literature in Formation." And the impetus for the Pope's letter was to help with the human formation of Catholic seminarians who aspire to be pastoral ministers. In writing it, though, Francis broadened it out to all Christians, and indeed all people engaged in pastoral work. He suggests at the start of the letter that reading novels and poetry constitute part of the path towards greater personal maturity. When life feels boring or disappointing, or prayer feels onerous, he continues, reading cultivates a peace of mind, quote, opening up new interior spaces that help us to avoid becoming trapped by a few obsessive thoughts, end quote. Much of this modern malaise he lays at the feet of social media. Quote, before our present unremitting exposure to social media, mobile phones, and other devices, reading was a common experience, and those who went through know what I mean. A personal confession for me, not the Pope. I, for my part, love reading, but the more time I spend around glowing screens and chirping devices, the less patience and attention I can summon for the pleasure of reading for leisure, except maybe in the summertime when our inboxes are chirping just a little bit less. I want to move to some important points of this letter without presuming to cover the entire thing, and identify some of the writers that he mentions and draws upon. So allow me to sketch out a few of the main voices and themes from Pope Francis's letter. After that, I will discuss some of the explicit and implicit sources that support his argument, and then I will offer some critical appraisal of the letter later on. So early in the letter, Pope Francis reflects on his own story, specifically his time teaching in Argentina during Regency, a stage of Jesuit formation spent teaching typically high school boys. While he was assigned to teach El Cantar de Mio Cid, the Spanish classic, to his teenage students, it turns out that teenagers, today like then, preferred the poetry of their contemporaries, and so he let them read the debonair Garcia Lorca. He said, "I decided that they could read El Cid at home, and during the lessons I would discuss the authors the students like best, usually contemporary literary works." The purpose, Pope Francis continues, was not simply to give them whatever they wanted. Rather, he employed the pedagogical principle of movement from the familiar to the less familiar, from what immediately grabbed their literary attention to what required a bit more time and attention. And he continues in the essay rather optimistically, "Yet as they read those works that interested them at the moment, they developed a more general taste for literature and poetry, and thus they moved on to other authors. In the end, our hearts always seek something greater, and individuals will find their own way in literature." End quote. So the Pope suggests that literature puts religious believers into contact with the culture of their time. Citing the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution, Gaudium et Spes, he writes, quote, "Literature and art seek to penetrate our nature and, quote, throw light on our suffering and our joy, our needs and our potentialities," end quote. Francis asks, how can one hope to reach and understand the core of cultures, ancient and new, if we disregard their symbols, messages, artistic expressions, and stories with which they have captured their loftiest ideas? At its best, he continues, the Church expresses itself in and through the many cultural milieus in which it finds itself. Church being grammatically feminine, I'll keep that from the text, Pope Francis writes, "The Church in her missionary experience has learned how to display all her beauty, freshness, and novelty in her encounter, often through literature, with the different cultures in which her faith has taken root, without hesitating to engage with and draw upon the best of what is found in each culture. This approach has freed her from the temptation to a blinkered fundamentalist self-referentiality that would consider only one cultural historical grammar as capable of expressing the entire richness and depth of the gospel." End quote. The metaphor of faith taking root and growing in different cultural soils suggests that lurking behind Francis's positive engagement with culture is an idea going back even before Christian thought of the logoi spermatikoi, that is, seminal or seed-like principles, which dates back to Hellenistic Stoics. The idea of seeds being scattered throughout the world, fittingly, was adopted by the likes of Christian thinkers such as Justin Martyr, Augustine, and Bonaventure. The metaphor is fairly clear. Just as a planted seed draws nourishment from its soil to grow into a tree or a plant, so God formed the world by scattering these rational seeds which grew into the plurality that we find around us, in nature, in human culture, in different religious expressions, everything. This helps explain how a creator God can be reconciled with the demonstrable fact that the new expressions of life are constantly emerging, and account too for the difference that we find in our world. Francis also expressly draws on the early church father, St. Basil of Caesarea, who extols the richness of classical literature produced by, quote, hoi exothen, those pagan outsiders those pagan authors who are coming from without the church. Basil suggests that the pagan classics are something to carry with us on the road of life, for their education and training and engagement with culture will help us in our engagement with culture. One example of this, perhaps, is St. Paul in his address to pagan Athenians on the Areopagus from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul's extensive education and rhetorical training allowed him to draw on two pagan poets, Epimenides and Aratus of Soli, in his own cultural encounter with difference. Paul quotes them to describe God as the one, quote, in whom we live and move and have our being. And as he goes on to say, and even some of your own poets have said, we too are his offspring. Commenting on this passage, Francis writes, Paul reveals that he is a reader, while also demonstrating his method of approaching a literary text, which is an evangelical discernment of culture. The Athenians dismiss him as espermologos, literally a babbler, but even more literally, a gatherer of seeds. What was surely meant to be an insult proved, ironically, to be profoundly true. Pope ends, Paul gathered the seeds of pagan poetry, and overcoming his own first impressions, acknowledges the Athenians to be extremely religious as well. If I may editorialize on this section of the letter, it's hard to fathom St. Paul lugging around an Oxford Companion of Hellenic Poets before talking with these learned Athenians. Still less could he Google pagan poets good for evangelization as he was taking an Uber up the winding road to the Areopagus. As another great Greek poet, Archilochus from Paros, wrote, "We do not rise to the level of our expectation, we fall to the level of our training." We do not rise to the level of our expectation, we fall to the level of our training. In battle, so in life. How are we equipping ourselves and our students with the intellectual tools and a body of cultural content to help them sift through culture today and respond to it from our deep tradition? As a classics and Spanish double major myself from Marquette, I treasure greatly the exposure to the thinkers and cultures of the past and from around the world, which help me to engage with and better grasp the culture in which we find ourselves today, the culture in which we live and move and have our being. And that returns us to Francis's letter. In a section entitled, Never a Disembodied Christ, he ventures an assessment of the contemporary religious landscape. Quote, "The return to the sacred and the quest for spirituality which mark our time are ambiguous phenomena." Are ambiguous phenomena. Today, our challenge is not so much atheism as the need to respond adequately to many people's thirst for God, lest they try to satisfy it with alienating solutions or with a disembodied Jesus. The urgent task of proclaiming the gospel in our time, Francis reasons, demands that believers, especially those in formation for ministry, ensure that everyone be able to encounter Jesus Christ, who is made flesh, who is made human, who is made part of human history. He writes, we must, quote, always take care never to lose sight of the flesh of Jesus Christ. That flesh made of passions, emotions, and feelings, words that challenge and words that console, hands that touch and hands that heal, looks that liberate and encourage, flesh made of hospitality, forgiveness, indignation, courage, fearlessness, in a word, love, end quote. Here again, one of the voices lurking in the background seems to be William Lynch, the mid-20th century philosopher and classicist turned literary scholar. William Lynch argued that what makes for quality literature is the slow engagement with finite particulars, not sidestepping them in favor of expediency or presuming to dispense universal truths in nice, pithy phrases. It is precisely when we descend into the realm of a finite story, in all of its messiness, in all of its slowness, and odd details, that great literature can stir insights within the reader. An object lesson in Lynch's insight, think back to the story with which I began this talk, in the reign of King Herod IV. I could have skipped those 5 or 7 minutes of exposition and reading, squinting in the dark, and extended quotations about tiny model apples and flies on them, and I could have just jumped to the moral of the story. Hey, academics, don't get lost in the weeds of your discipline. And you would have promptly bristled and told me, take a hike, Padre. And rightly so. Stories are powerful, and they work on us slowly to yield their varied fruit. Engagement with the embodied life stories of Jesus, like engagement with the life stories of our students, of our colleagues. All of this takes time to digest, to consider, to discern the meaning of. Engagement with those whom we want to get to know, or those who we quickly cross the street to avoid because we're running late. This is the sort of incarnational messiness that great literature encourages us to encounter, to read through slowly and carefully. Just as a seminarian must be careful not to get so in his head that he makes disembodied pronouncements about how to live the life of faith, so too we academics, Pope Francis might say, ought to make space for the slow work of intellectual and spiritual formation in ourselves, among ourselves, and for our students. That this takes time should not be surprising. Pope Francis draws implicitly on a few voices from literary theory, notably Wolfgang Iser, who was responsible for reader response theory to textual interpretation. Pope Francis suggests, quote, readers in some sense rewrite a text, enlarging its scope through their imagination, creating a whole world by bringing into play their skills, their memory, their dreams, and their personal history, with all of its drama and all of its symbolism. In this way, what emerges is a text quite different from the one the author intended to write, end quote. The mention of play here, of playing with the text and engaging in interpretation, summons also Gadamer, who focused on the reader's play with the text, and the capacity for the reader's horizon and the writers to merge in the horizon of the text, a great German word, Horizontsverschmelzung, which is the name of my upcoming band. Another takeaway is that reading literature cultivates the reader's empathic imagination with another. The Pope approvingly quotes C.S. Lewis about how reading the greats cultivates curiosity about the lives of those around us. Quote, in reading great literature, I become 1,000 people, this is Lewis, I become 1,000 people and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do that. That's from his book, An Experiment in Criticism. Jorge Luis Borges said that reading literature is, quote, listening to another person's voice, end quote. Pope Francis picks up on this and says that the absence of this encounter, the refusal to listen to another person's voice, leads to self-isolation and what he calls a spiritual deafness, which damages our relationship ultimately with God, but more importantly, with ourself. We might think back to that miniature model maker who has forsaken fellow humans to become so absorbed in his craft that he becomes untethered from reality as such. The Pope later draws on a letter from T.S. Eliot to highlight the problem of faith today in the Western world. He says, quote, it is the inability of so many of our contemporaries to be profoundly moved in the face of God, of God's creation, and other human beings, end quote. Pope Francis made a trip to Japan a number of years ago, and on the return trip, somebody asked him, what is it that the West can learn from the East? His response simply was, I think the West lacks a bit of poetry. Now, I could go on at great length discussing this excellent letter, but I won't. I hope rather that I have whetted your appetite enough for you to read through it, slowly, meditatively perhaps, yourself. Allow me to make a few critiques and offer some final takeaways on it, and then we can open this up for conversation amongst ourselves. A few months ago, our dean, Heidi Bostic, and her husband, Stephen, came over for dinner, and the first thing she asked me was, have you read it? What are you talking about? The Pope's letter on literature. I thought, I like this woman. We discussed it at length over dinner, and she pointed out quite rightly that all of the authors and theologians that were quoted or cited were men. Karl Rahner, Basil of Caesarea, C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, Marcel Proust, Paul Celan, to name but a few. Are there no female authors or thinkers who could make a contribution to this conversation of faith and literature? One of those most cited theologians in the text is Antonio Speraro, the Italian Jesuit and papal confidant who just finished his long tenure as editor of La Civiltà Cattolica in Rome, which is the Jesuit newspaper. When this letter came out, I wrote to Father Speraro to ask if he had any hand in writing it, since his theological fingerprints and quite a few footnotes are all over the letter. No, wasn't me, he said. Nor was it from the Portuguese poet-priest José Tolentino de Mendonça, whom the Pope made a cardinal and appointed prefect of the Vatican's Dicastery for Culture and Education back in 2022. It wasn't the poet-priest from Portugal either. This seems to be, at least on the limited research that I've done, something that came from the Pope's reading and writing and thinking himself. First off, where does he find the time to read and write this much? But secondly, we might respond and situate Dr. Bostic's reasonable critique in the context that Pope Francis is an 87-year-old Argentinian cleric formed in a time and a place very different to our own. For him, as a young Jesuit in Buenos Aires, pushing the envelope entailed letting students read the rakish poetry of Garcia Lorca instead of the more traditional Spanish classics that they were assigned. The idea of expanding the canon to female authors and authors from beyond Europe and the Americas, I gather, was not on his radar. We do not rise to the level of our expectations, but fall to the level of our training. And perhaps that brings us to the challenge and invitation of Pope Francis's letter to you and me today. How do we balance a respect for traditional authors with the need to engage emerging literature of the world from beyond the North Atlantic? Do we, the grown-ups who have given our lives to depth and breadth and learning, do we make time for reading writers both old and new? At my previous institution, I had the pleasure of helping organize a conference in Rome entitled The Global Aesthetics of the Catholic Imagination. We had contemporary authors from the UK, from all over Europe, from Canada, Sri Lanka, India, Nigeria, Kenya, heck, even Ohio. I had the joy of compiling all of the different reading excerpts from the writers, men and women alike, translating a few poems from Italian. This sometimes tedious work of reading and editing and compiling revealed many beautiful insights that are at once particular to their local situation and universal. Universal in two senses. Universal in that they model the shared human experience of the joys and hopes, fears and anxiety of every human person that Gaudium et Spes talks about. But also universal in the sense of Catholic, in that the Church is at once both always experienced locally and also always a participation in the universal body of Christ. As the Jesuit writer William Lynch that I mentioned earlier would remind us, the universal must descend to be mediated through the particular, and in our encounters with those particulars, we gain a sense of the whole once again, and there is no sidestepping the particulars. And so I would suggest that our challenge is to open our eyes to those emerging writers and poets today. Maybe even some of them are in our classroom at this very point as we're teaching them. In a previous address from 2016, Pope Francis called all Christians to cultivate a, quote, culture of encounter. Can I get someone to read this for us here?
At a time in history marked by rapid changes and increasingly complex challenges, the role of academic institutions is essential. Yours is the task not only of forming fine minds, but also of developing generous hearts and consciences attentive to the dignity of every person. Education happens on three levels: the head, the heart, and the hands. Think about what you feel and do. Think about what you think and do what you think and feel. Yet these three things should always be in harmony. The mind must be formed so that the heart can be generous, able to engage with reality and the demands of the time, and the hands must be able to work actively. Form hardworking dreamers, and above all, be so yourself. To move forward in life, we need to dream. A person who has lost the ability to dream lacks creativity, lacks poetry, and life without poetry does not work.
Actually, thank you very much for reading that. I think this is actually a slide from towards the end of the talk, which was an address that he gave to members of the Board of Trustees from Loyola University Chicago in May of this past year when they were visiting. And yet I think it still stands up. The larger point of the culture of encounters that I was going to read, I'll just read in brief here. Pope Francis writes, "Life, for all of its confrontations, is the art of encounter." He says, "I have frequently called for the growth of a culture of encounter capable of transcending our differences and divisions. This means working to create a many-faceted polyhedron whose different sides form a unity in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The image of the polyhedron can represent a society or a university or a college where differences coexist, complement each other, enrich each other, and reciprocally illuminate one another, even amidst disagreements or reservations. As the Pope says, each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. This also means that finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, for they have another way of looking at things. They see aspects of reality that are invisible to the centers of power where weighty decisions are made." End quote. So the problems of that miniature model maker was not that he was committed deeply to excellence at his craft, in his discipline, but what he missed was the ability to once again lift his eyes again and see what opportunity and resonances lay around him for empathic engagement with others, for attention to those voices on the margins. As the great Sesame Street song says, "Who are the people in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood?" You can sing it in your head. A little engagement with the empathic imagination reveals that we stand on the shoulders of giants and benefit from engagement with those around us. For example, I wouldn't be speaking here today apart from the generous invitation from Dr. Melissa Gans in English and the team of those involved in this Humanities colloquium. I wouldn't have that short story to draw upon apart from my friendship with another Jesuit, Father Spinelli, who is training future public school teachers to teach at our student institution, Fordham in Manhattan. I wouldn't be here as a student having experienced much without Doctors Anna Passero and Scott Dale and Belen Castaneda and John Pustayevsky and Patricia Marquardt and Stephen Beal, who taught me the humbling task of learning another language and screwing up, of teaching me how to encounter voices from the past and from the present from lands far away, helping us to hear historical voices who have much to offer amidst the noise of our modern situation. But where we are right now, politically and otherwise, that's a topic for another day. Allow me to conclude my thoughts with some advice from Pope Francis that we just heard, given to the institution of Loyola University. And I just want to focus on that quote in the middle there. Yours is the task not only of forming fine minds, but also of developing generous hearts and consciences attentive to the dignity of every person. Education happens on 3 levels: the head, the heart, and the hands. Think about what you feel and do, feel what you think and do what you think and feel. Yet these 3 things should always be in harmony. Here's my last page, here we go. At first, Pope Francis imagined that he needed to write a letter to help broaden the minds and hearts of future priests in their formation. But the fact that he lifted his eyes to see the needs of the world just beyond seminaries, gazing perhaps to fractious cultures like our own, perhaps ones that have forgotten where we come from and have forgotten that we belong to one another, to a world that has traded empathy for emails and memorable literature to memes. I argue that just as Pope Francis is encouraging seminarians to get out of their heads and have contact with the needs of the world, so too each of us in our siloed disciplines would do well to lift our eyes, to consider the points of contact between and among our various disciplines in the humanities. And because our students before us and the colleagues around us carry within them the seeds of our future.